Did you know that there's a child in Burma called 8,278? She's 9 years old and one of an estimated 75,000 active child soldiers in the country. By the time she turns 14, 8,278 will have engaged in armed conflict, killed or been killed, endured sexual assault and become addicted to amphetamines. If she doesn't die of starvation, participating in war, drug overdose, AIDS, or punishment for attempting to escape, 8,278 will suffer emotional disturbances for the rest of her life. This is 2011, and this is slavery. Its gentler title of human trafficking is really insufficient in conveying the gross and hideous nature of what has become one of the most lucrative industries in the world. And yet this afternoon I'd like to discuss not so much the magnitude of this injustice, but rather its relationship to the ideals of the United Nations. Because I believe that slavery's solution can be found in the application of those principles that originally brought together the United Nations long ago. And so we'll explore this idea today by first evaluating the history of the United Nations. And then we'll delve into modern slavery, and hopefully begin to understand why it remains one of our international community's greatest obligations. You see, in the year 1941, prompted by the reality of a growing global threat, Winston Churchill and our President Franklin Roosevelt convened to discuss a plan of action. At the time of their meeting, Germany had already invaded Denmark, Norway, Romania, and several other countries. So Adolf Hitler's power was increasing. Joseph Stalin and his Soviet Union posed a threat as well. And it was in the midst of this chaos that Churchill and Roosevelt chose to meet. They produced a document declaring that both Britain and the US would confront the Axis powers in order to preserve and ensure the rights of men. And when the ensuing World War cost millions their lives, another charter was drawn up to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. It was to promote conditions under which justice and peace and security could be upheld, and these principles laid the foundation for the United Nations. It was an effort to reaffirm global faith in the dignity and worth of a human being. It was a monumental event, bringing together more than 50 countries to form an international organization during the aftermath of what many have called history's greatest catastrophe. And yet today, I believe the United Nations is being faced with perhaps an even greater catastrophe. Which brings us to my second point, because modern slavery is a catastrophe that I would venture has the potential to even eclipse the tragedies of World War II. Every minute, 7 people are sold into slavery. 2 of them are children. Which means that by the time I conclude this presentation, nearly 50 new people will have entered this international slave trade. They become prostitutes or sex workers, domestic servants, laborers in brick kilns or sweatshops. The children are sometimes forced into armed conflict or guerrilla warfare. There are literally fishing villages in Ghana, where young boys are tied to heavy stones and thrown into the water to untangle their master's fishing nets. And if a fisherman fails to pull his slave up before it's too late, the boy drowns. But it never matters, because slaves are expendable. In fact, according to Dr. Kevin Bales, president of a human rights organization called Free the Slaves, there are more than 27 million slaves worldwide today. That's more than there have ever been before in history. Former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright has called human trafficking the fastest growing criminal enterprise globally. Benjamin Skinner, a Wesleyan University journalist, spent 5 years traveling the world to observe modern slavery firsthand. And in his book entitled A Crime So Monstrous, he acknowledged that slavery is very much alive on every continent. And it's important to note the resounding agreement between this journalist and the president of Free the Slaves and the former Secretary of State. Gary Hagen, who's the president of the International Justice Mission, which is another Christian human rights agency, he agrees. The former director of the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, Antonio Costa, echoes the same sentiment, and he made the assertion before a New York University student audience that international law is not a wish list. And he said countries ought to be held accountable to comply with the international law that they've agreed to. He said not enough is being done, and certainly not fast enough, given the size of this problem. Our own Pledge of Allegiance here in the United States ends with the words liberty and justice for all, which I think is ironic, because I do understand that this is an American creed, but I believe liberty and justice should extend beyond the borders of our own country. Liberty and justice truly ought to be for all, or at least sought for all. And this isn't so much a political philosophy as it is a moral mandate, which is why my desire is to serve in our international community and to uphold human rights for those suffering under oppression. Because 8,278 is not a fictional character. 8,278 is a real slave in Burma, and her real name is Hetet Miat. And I have the privilege of wearing a set of dog tags that includes Hetet's name, her age, and her status as an active child soldier. And these remind me that slavery is not dead. And so our policy toward this injustice should be the same as Winston Churchill's when he confronted injustice with Franklin Roosevelt more than a half-century ago. He said, "We will wage war with all our might and with all the strength that God can give us against a monstrous tyranny, a tyranny unsurpassed in the dark catalog of human crime." That's our policy. And that's the policy that I've adopted for my future. These ideals reflect my aspirations to seek justice and to reaffirm the God-given dignity and worth of a human being. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Taylor, I worked for Human Rights Watch for a year, which is actually right here in this building, which is convenient. But I'm sure, as you know, there's a lot of different sectors within the world of human rights where you can have a voice with something like child trafficking, with sex trafficking, with human trafficking. So I'm wondering, what areas specifically have you thought? Is it more legal? Is it business rights? Is it lobbying? Is it serving within the UN? What area do you see yourself in, and what area do you see yourself making the most impact?
Yes, sir. I know that I'd like to work and enter law, international law. I'm not sure if I'd like to work with a nonprofit or actually in a government organization, whether it be the United Nations or the State Department. I'd like to work in South America, and so I'm not sure. I actually spent 2 months in Ecuador last summer, and that's part of what kind of got my interest sparked with international affairs and different things. But I'm still trying to decide whether or not I'll enter a career in, I know that I'd like to go into law, and so I actually visited the International Justice Mission. I interviewed some of the people there and just to talk about kind of where they've been in life, and they said that most of the people who actually work with the International Justice Mission spent 30, 40 years working in their fields, whether they be criminal justice officials or law enforcement officials or police officers or lawyers. And so I know that I'd like to go into law, and I'd like to study criminal justice and work more I'd like to be boots on ground, if that makes sense. But at the same time, I'd like to have the ability to kind of walk into a courtroom and be able to kind of argue and uphold the human rights that different people have in different countries. I wouldn't say that I'm specifically focused on a specific form of human trafficking yet. I'm still kind of figuring out where I think God is going to lead me with that. So, does that answer your question?
It does. And actually, most of our research and most people within Human Rights Watch went and had pursued law degrees.
Oh,
Lawyers.
that's impressive.
So you're intense. You've got focus, man. So it makes me wonder, how long have you been passionate about this? And like, how deep in your bones is this? And how did it get there?
Okay. I never wanted to be a lawyer because I didn't think there was really anything you could do. Like from the television shows you watch, I used to watch Matlock and stuff. So if you see someone wants to sue this person because they stole his power toothbrush and stuff, and that didn't really seem like something I wanted to do. But everyone told me that I should do. Actually, my parents told me I should be a lawyer because I argue so much. And I don't know if that was a good thing or not. But my interest in human rights and human trafficking was sparked when I went to Ecuador 2 summers ago. But then the next year I started competing in speech and debate. And so my speech last year, the topic was Edmund Burke's quote, "All that is required for evil to prevail is for good men to do nothing." We used a lot of a lot of examples, or they called them applications, and they were some really powerful stories and a lot of really sad stories, and I think a lot of them were used just to evoke an emotional response from judges. And so I felt like at a certain point in the year, we were more just using the stories of different people as a way to kind of like buy a judge, or come up and just share a really mean story, and this is why you shouldn't vote for my opponent. And so because my speech and debate, it was so closely interlocked, I kind of had to do a lot of research with that and really open my eyes to that. And I realized, there are different aspects of law that you can pursue where you don't have to be arguing about a power toothbrush. So that was exciting to me. But I think that was really what sparked my passion last year, just being able to delve into that some more. And I've always had a passion to work with people who are less privileged than myself, I think. So it was kind of a cool little. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Thanks, David.